Let's try to understand the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model using this worksheet. In this example, we will only work with the demand side of the economy and try to understand the factors affecting aggregate demand. So, what's aggregate demand? It is the right-hand side of our main equation, that is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So the entire thing on the right-hand side is aggregate demand. So let's take a look at this first question here. Consumers expect an economic downturn. This is about consumers, the C component, and consumers cut their spending because of their expectations that will lower the aggregate demand. Okay, so let's show that on a graph. We know that aggregate demand is a downward sloping curve, and that is the relationship between real GDP and the general price level. We call it the CPI. That is an inverse relationship. As the price level goes down, real GDP will go up. But in this case, what's changing is C, consumption. A decline in consumption will lower the aggregate demand at each price level, and that will cause a leftward shift in AD. In the second question, we have a new US president and the profit expectations of business executives rise. It looks like this is about the I component, the investment component. So we expect investments to go up. What is the effect on aggregate demand? The I component is an AD component, so an increase in I investments will increase AD. So let's put that again on our graph. So I'm going to start with the generic AD downward sloping curve. Always remember we have the CPI on the vertical axis and real GDP on the horizontal axis, and with the increased investments, what happens to the aggregate demand in the economy? It will increase. That is a rightward shift in aggregate demand. In the third case, we have the federal government increasing spending for highways, bridges, and other infrastructure. This is all about the government expenditures that is increasing once again because it's a component of AD. The aggregate demand curve will also increase. Let's put that here again. So we have this aggregate demand initially showing the relationship between the CPI and real GDP. With more government expenditures, total spending, total demand for all the goods and services will increase. And that is a rightward shift in AD. And the last situation, we have the United States increasing exports of wheat and other crops to Russia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet republics. This is about exports. Exports are increasing. That will be an increase in net exports altogether. This will also increase. As we know, this is again a part of aggregate demand. So what happens to aggregate demand? It will increase once again. We can show that as a rightward shift in aggregate demand. So always put everything on each axis, and this is good practice. This question is about the supply side of the economy and the factors affecting aggregate supply. Let's first remember what general factors affect the aggregate supply in the economy. Aggregate supply factors are anything that affects the cost of production, which includes, of course, price of inputs, technology and productivity, taxes, subsidies, and regulations. And as we see here, all of these factors are affecting the cost of production, and therefore aggregate supply. Okay, let's try one more time. So the aggregate supply factors are anything that affects the cost of production. So we're looking for things like the price of inputs, technology and productivity, taxes, subsidies, and regulations. Let's take a look at the first case. The price of gasoline increases because of a catastrophic oil spill. So this is about the price of an input, the price of oil increases affecting the cost of production, and the cost increases, of course, that will lower aggregate supply. So let's use our aggregate supply curve, which is an upward sloping curve in the short run. And that is again the relationship between the price level, the CPI, and real GDP. With an increase in the oil prices, the cost of production will increase, lowering aggregate supply. That is a leftward shift in AS. In the second case, we have labor unions and all other workers agree to a cut in wages to stimulate the economy. Now we have the price of labor, the wage rate is going down. This is again the price of an input, the price of labor goes down. At a lower cost of production, aggregate supply goes up. Let's show that using our aggregate supply curve. Initially, we're here showing the direct relationship between the general price level and real GDP. With lower wage rates, firms can produce more, increasing aggregate supply. In the third case, we have power companies switch to solar power and the price of electricity falls. Again, this is just the price of an input here. Electricity goes down. At lower cost, more supply is produced. And that will be a rightward shift in aggregate supply again because we have a lower cost of production. As always, we'll put everything, real GDP and CPI, on both on these two axes. And the last one, the federal government increases the excise tax on gasoline in order to finance a deficit. In this case, we have an increase in tax, which is also increasing the cost of production, and that will lower aggregate supply. What kind of shift do we have here with higher costs? It's going to be a leftward shift in aggregate supply. And we have the CPI price level here and real GDP on the horizontal axis. Now in this question, we will bring the demand side of the economy and the supply side of the economy together, and we'll try to understand the equilibrium in the economy and what happens when there's a factor changing on the demand side or on the supply side, and what happens to real GDP, employment, and price level. So let's take a look at these examples. Assume an economy operates in the intermediate range of its aggregate supply curve. So I'm going to start with that. That means we have the upward sloping aggregate supply. That is the intermediate range of the aggregate supply curve. Let's always put what we have on each axis. We have the CPI and real GDP. And then what happens if the price of crude oil rises significantly? Let's also add our aggregate demand. Initially, we are at this equilibrium in the economy. This is for the macroeconomy. In this economy, the economy is in equilibrium at this real GDP level, and the price level is the CPI. But the price of crude oil rises significantly. This is the price of oil. This is the price of an input. And we know that that'll impact the cost of production. And remember, the cost of production is affecting aggregate supply. With higher cost of production, aggregate supply declines. That is a leftward shift in aggregate supply. Let's show that. Now we have a new equilibrium in the economy. At this new equilibrium, real GDP goes down and the price level goes up. Let's take a look at the macroeconomic problems here. A decline in real GDP, as we know, is called a recession. So we have a recession here. If that decline in real GDP is more than 2 consecutive quarters, it is a recession. An increase in the CPI is called inflation. So it looks like a leftward shift in aggregate supply is causing a recession and inflation at the same time in the economy. And we have a name for that. We have a recession and inflation together, and we call it stagflation. Stagnation and inflation together. And that happens when the aggregate supply curve decreases. It's a leftward shift in aggregate supply. What happens in the second case? Spending on national defense doubles. Before I do anything, I want to first show the initial equilibrium in the economy, assuming that the economy is in equilibrium in this hypothetical case. We have the AS curve upward sloping and the generic AD curve downward sloping. We have the real GDP and the CPI right here, and we have this equilibrium real GDP and the CPI level. And we know that spending on national defense doubles. It looks like this is the government expenditures. G, it increases. Well, let's remember if this is a supply factor or a demand factor for the macroeconomy. It's part of the AD. If the government expenditures go up, aggregate demand will also go up. So I need to show that change on my graph. So that is a rightward shift in AD. And when the AD shifts, AD increases. Now we have a new equilibrium in this economy. Real GDP goes up, but it will cause some price increases, CPI. So our question is, what happens to the price level? The price level increases. All right. Employment will increase. Employment will increase because the economy is producing more GDP. Let's put that as well. Real GDP increases, increasing employment. And that's it. Now let's add some different cases. In this case, the cost of important goods that are used as imports in production increase. So the prices of imported goods that are used as inputs, that shows the prices of inputs go up. And I want to show that using our ADAS model. Initially, we are at equilibrium using the initial AD and AS. In this hypothetical economy, we have real GDP on the horizontal axis and CPI on the vertical axis. Here we have the initial equilibrium. And we know that an increase in the price of an input goes up. That affects the cost of production, and anything that increases the cost of production will affect aggregate supply. So let's put that here. That will lower aggregate supply, that is a leftward shift. Do we have a new equilibrium in this economy? Yes. What happens to real GDP? Real GDP goes down. So let's put that here, real GDP goes down. The price level goes up. And what happens to employment? Employment goes down. In other words, there will be more unemployment in this economy. How about the next one? An improvement in technology raises labor productivity. So in this case, productivity is increasing. We know that this is all about the cost of production, and this is affecting aggregate supply in the economy. So let's again put everything that we know. We have the AS and AD curves, real GDP, the CPI, and since productivity increased, our aggregate supply also increases. That is a rightward shift in AS. Initially, we were at this equilibrium. The equilibrium real GDP goes up. Okay, real GDP goes up. What happens to the price level? The price level decreases with increased supply in the economy. And what happens to employment? Employment increases with more production, more GDP. That means unemployment decreases as employment increases. Okay, so let's take a look at this question. This is a little bit different. What shifts in aggregate supply and aggregate demand could cause each of the following conditions for an economy? In this case, we don't know what kind of shift we have, but we know the results. Okay, so let's start with our initial equilibrium. Here we have real GDP and the price level, the CPI. So I'm just going to put that P1 and real GDP 1 and P and real GDP. I'm using P for the CPI, that is for the general price level in the economy. It is not the price of a specific good. We're talking about the prices of all the goods and services. So the price level rises, that's what we know, and real GDP rises. So what kind of change in this economy will give us this result? If I look at all the different options, I can tell that an increase in aggregate demand, a rightward shift in aggregate demand, would actually result in higher real GDP and higher prices. Okay, so I'm just going to say an increase in AD will increase the price level and increase real GDP. Let's take a look at the next one. The price level falls and real GDP rises. I always start with my generic equilibrium in this economy. And let's show the, let's put the price here. Let's show the initial equilibrium as P1 and real GDP 1. And in this case, we know the price level falls and GDP rises. Okay, so let's think about what kind of change in this economy would give us this result. We're looking for a decrease in the price and an increase in real GDP. So this happens only if we increase the aggregate supply curve. So when we have a rightward shift in aggregate supply, we will have a decline in prices and an increase in real GDP. Let's take a look at the third one. The price level falls and real GDP falls. I'm going to put that here. As always, we're starting with the initial equilibrium, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Here we have real GDP and the price level. Initially, we're at P1 and real GDP 1. And we know that the price level should go down and real GDP should also go down. What kind of shift or what kind of change will give us this result? This only happens if I shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. The AD shifts to the left. And at the new equilibrium, we will have a lower price in this economy and lower output. Okay, so that means we have a decline in aggregate demand. In the second one, we forgot to put that here, and that is an increase in AS, a rightward shift. Here, increased real GDP and lowered the prices. We have more cases. Let's take a look at this one. The price level rises and real GDP falls. Once again, let's start with the initial equilibrium in our economy. And initially we're at P1 and real GDP 1. We want the price level to go up and the real GDP to go down. Okay, so I want to see what kind of shift would give us this result. It looks like only a decline in the AS curve will give us this result, and as the AS curve shifts down or shifts to the left, we have higher prices and lower output, and we define this as stagflation. Stagflation, that is the combination of recession and inflation. So we have this increase in the price level causing prices to go up and a decline in the total output causing a recession. The next one is a little bit different. In this case, we have the price level falls and real GDP remains the same. Okay, so it looks like we need to add more to our graph. And to do that, I want to include the 3 ranges of aggregate supply, not just the upward sloping portion, but all the Keynesian, intermediate, and vertical portions of the aggregate supply curve. Always remember we have real GDP here and the price level here. So what happens? The price level falls and real GDP remains the same. What will give us this result? Let's think about that. We want the real GDP to remain the same, but we want the prices to fall. So I need to decide where I should place my aggregate demand curve. And this result will happen only if I place my aggregate demand curve up here. Let's make it 81. And if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, actually, let me make this black, just like the other ones. Okay, so I'm going to place the AD curve up here, and if I have a leftward shift in aggregate demand here, okay, a leftward shift in aggregate demand, AD goes down. What happens here? The real GDP remains the same, but the price level goes down. Here we have the initial price level. The price level goes down, but the real GDP level remains the same. And this happens only when the aggregate demand curve initially is placed on the horizontal portion of the AS curve. Okay, so it's right here. The next one is also a little bit different. In this case, the price level remains the same and real GDP increases. To do that, I also want to include all the three ranges of aggregate supply: the Keynesian range, the intermediate range, and the classical range. Again, we have the price level and real GDP, but now I need to decide where I should place my AD to have that price level remains the same. So it looks like if I place my aggregate demand curve down here, remember that this represents a severe recession. We're far away from full employment. Where is full employment here? The full employment level of output is here, but currently we're operating at real GDP 1, that is far away from full employment level of output. In this case, if we increase aggregate demand, we can increase aggregate demand. What happens? The AD curve shifts to the right. The real GDP will go up. At the new equilibrium, real GDP will go up, but the price level will remain the same because we're operating below full employment, and at this level of real GDP, there are many idle resources. There's a lot of unemployment of labor and capital. As we increase aggregate demand at this level of real GDP, we're using those idle resources, and increasing AD is not actually pushing the prices up because, again, we have plenty of resources. But as we get closer and closer to full employment, what happens? The prices are starting to increase, and it's because the resources are becoming more scarce, and more employment of resources are causing the prices of these resources to go up, leading to price increases. But when we're operating on the Keynesian range, when we're far away from full employment level of output, an increase in aggregate demand is not going to increase prices. And that is, of course, consistent with the Keynesian fixed prices. Prices are fixed in the short run. As the real GDP increases, the price level remains the same. Let's do a few more. Again, we're going to be using the equilibrium in the overall economy using the AS and AD curves. Now we're the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. There's been an extremely hot and dry summer due to a climate change known as the greenhouse effect. As a result, crop production has fallen drastically. The President calls you to the White House to discuss the impact on the economy. Would you explain to the President that a sharp drop in U.S. crop production would cause inflation, unemployment, or both? So to do that, we need to understand the state of the economy. Initially, we're at equilibrium, let's say at P1 and real GDP 1. And because of the hot and dry summer, Now we have crop production decreased. This is all about supply. Aggregate supply falls. That is a leftward shift in aggregate supply. Let's show that here on our graph. At the new equilibrium, what happens to the price level? The price level goes up. The real GDP goes down. So what kind of problems do we have in this economy? Definitely we have inflation because the price level goes up. And also we see that the level of output falls. A decline in real GDP is called recession. So we have a recession. And because of the recession, of course, we have unemployment. Due to the unemployment, firms will lay off workers. What kind of problems do we have here? We have inflation plus recession. Together, it's called stagflation. And it looks like in this economy we have both inflation, price increases, and unemployment in this economy due to a decrease in aggregate supply. A leftward shift in aggregate supply is causing both inflation and unemployment. In 1939, with the U.S. economy not yet fully recovered from the Great Depression, President Roosevelt proclaimed that Thanksgiving would fall a week earlier than usual, so that the shopping period before Christmas would be longer. Explain what President Roosevelt might have been trying to achieve using the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we need to draw the initial equilibrium back in 1939 before Thanksgiving. Let's assume it's this equilibrium here with this price level and output level, real GDP. And the president at the time is extending the shopping period, extending the Thanksgiving holiday so that people can shop for a longer period of time. So what happens, if consumers are spending more, that means this is part of the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand increases. That is a rightward shift in aggregate demand. With that, what do we have here? The prices are higher, but total output is also higher. So the president at the time, back in 1939, when the economy is still in a depression, in a recession, we see that the president did that on purpose. The goal was to stimulate demand, increase demand, and increase output. As a result, what happens? Real GDP increases. As the real GDP goes up, employment increases. And that was the entire purpose. And when that happens, the price level will also go up. Let's think about this question. Equilibrium GDP is the same as full employment. Do you agree or disagree? Let's first remember the equilibrium in an economy. And I want to use the full aggregate supply, which has three portions. We have the Keynesian portion, we have the intermediate portion, and we have the vertical classical portion of the AS. On the vertical side, we have the price level. On the horizontal side, we have real GDP. And according to Keynes, an economy can be in equilibrium anywhere on the AS curve. The economy can be, for example, here, and produces this level of output. But this is not the full employment level of output. We know that the full employment level of output is right here. This is the full employment level of real GDP. How do we know that? Because at full employment, we're using all the resources to produce the maximum amount of goods and services in the economy. This economy is using all the resources, and it is not possible to produce anything more than that. For example, this economy does not have the resources to produce more than full employment level of output. This is our full employment, but the economy is in equilibrium below full employment, let's say E1. This economy can be in equilibrium, let's say, at E2. Let me mark this as E2. This economy can be in equilibrium anywhere. And I'm going to put one more here. All of these are possible equilibriums in this economy, but there's only one equilibrium at full employment, and that is E4. So it's right here. This E4 equilibrium is the full employment equilibrium. So going back to the question, equilibrium GDP is the same as full employment. This is a false statement. We do not agree, because the equilibrium real GDP can be at full employment, below full employment, or above full employment. It's not necessarily at the full employment. But our goal is always to bring the economy to the full employment level of output, because below full employment level of output, we have the recession problem, we have unemployment, recession, and unemployment. And above the full employment level of output, we have the inflation problem. Of course, we do not want inflation, high level of inflation. We do not want a recession. We do not want unemployment in an economy. So we want to bring the economy to full employment level of real GDP using our policies. This last question is about the long run economic growth. We earlier said that the economy's capacity is limited with its resources. For example, if our full employment level of output is here, this is the long run aggregate supply curve, and this is the full employment level of real GDP. All right, so we have the price level and we have the real GDP right here. But are we stuck at this level of real GDP forever? Is this our economy's capacity forever? The answer is no, because in time, if we can increase our resources, we can expand our economy's capacity, and this economy can produce more goods and services, and the full employment level of output will shift to the right. Before I do that, I want to remind you our resources. So what are the resources? Resources we use in production are natural resources, labor, and capital. And as we remember, production is a function of our resources. These are our inputs,